joining us. My name is Kate Piontek. I'm the VP of Operations here at the Wine Growers. First, I just wanted to thank everybody for your flexibility. I know this is not how we originally intended in hosting the Soil Health Symposium, but due to the coronavirus and some of the large gatherings that are being canceled, we just thought it was in everybody's best interest to move to a webinar. So thank you for logging on and being here. Unfortunately, this may be how we have to carry on meetings for the next couple of months, so this is a good test pilot for us, so please forgive us for any technical difficulties we experience along the way. But I wanted to give you a couple of overview in case any of you have not been on a webinar before. There is a Q&A function. We do still want to make this as interactive as possible. So after each speaker, I will basically be looking through the Q&A section. So please submit any of your questions through that function down at the bottom of your screen. And then once the presenter is done speaking, I'll look through the questions and read them live, and then the presenter can respond in live on camera. So you'll see kind of a hybrid of images and live camera action, and then also the PowerPoint presentation. So back to the reason we're all here. This is the second year that we've partnered with the Sonoma Resource Conservation District. We're super happy to bring you this valuable content. I know for our grape growers, soil health has been like the #1 priority of theirs in terms of education. So really happy to have some amazing speakers and a great lineup for you guys here today. So I'm going to kick it over to Keith Abels. Right here, you're going to see him on camera in a second, and he's going to lead you through the next couple of hours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar, webcast presentation, and thanks for your flexibility as we changed our format. I know it's been a challenging week for everyone, but I'm glad we can still carry on and have our presentation here, and thank you for joining us. And thank you to the wine growers for providing this opportunity very quickly. So just a couple quick things. Just keep in mind there's a question and answer button on your webinar screen, and you should use that. There'll be times later in the presentation where we will take those question and answers and give the panelists and presenters a chance to answer them. Also, we had a number of handouts on soil health and our soil health program and related to what you'll be hearing today. So we will be providing that later. I'm not sure when we will have that set up, but we do have your email addresses. We'll provide that information, and you can look forward to that. We will also be setting up a webcast or YouTube, or we're not quite sure yet, but it will be available to you, and we'll let you know how you can view this later or share it with other people that might be interested. So I'm from the Resource Conservation District. I'm Keith Abels. I'm the Soil and Water Specialist. And at the RCD, our main role is to help people protect their soil and water resources and to balance production needs with environmental needs. And the soil health program has been a big emphasis of ours the last few years, and there's been a lot of interest, which has been really exciting. And really what we're talking about, we're emphasizing the use and education of cover crops, compost, reduced tillage, and woody plantings like hedgerows and riparian plantings. So we're part of the North Coast Soil Hub, and I encourage you to log on to soilhub.org to find out more. It's 3 counties, 4 RCDs are involved, and we're basically promoting vineyard soil health and good production. So for the North Coast Soil Hub, we have a website that I just mentioned, but there's also a roughly quarterly newsletter that we provide there, and you can go to that site and find more information and more resources that should be of interest to you. Also part of our soil health work, we have demonstration projects. We're going to hear about one of them today, but we have one at the Sara Lee Vineyard, and we have had a lot of excitement and interest there. We're also starting one up at Quivira Vineyards, and part of what we do is we do quarterly workshops, and our plan is to have one on June 23rd at Jackson Family Wines. That's the Sara Lee Vineyard, and we hope you can join us for that, and we hope that events and field demos are not a problem then. We do have, like I say, we have quarterly workshops. We'll be doing something again in spring and fall. So look, take a look at our website. We'll be emailing you at your email address and through other outreach channels, so you know when we have events like this. We're doing carbon farm plans where we look at a host of soil health practices as well as ways to reduce greenhouse gases on your farm. And also we have something exciting that you should be aware of. We have technical assistant site visits available to discuss soil health practices of all types. and they are free, and we encourage you to contact us. A lot of those site visits then lead to carbon farm plans or to doing designs, stream flow enhancement plans, and in some cases, irrigation evaluations, irrigation system evaluations. So take a look at our website and keep an eye out for everything that's going on. The highlight of today is our speaker, Dr. Patty Skinkis. I feel really lucky that we have her as we started going down this road of soil health, and I was inquiring with the people who are ahead of this in our field in the area. I'm asking, like, who are the people to talk to? Who really knows the most? Who's doing the research? Where are the academics at? I was talking to people, you know, what's going on at UC Davis, and all roads kept leading to Dr. Skinkis. She's really probably done more research in the types of questions in vineyard situations that we're looking at. So I'm going to read her official bio now, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Skinkis, and she's going to give her presentation. And when she's done, she'll take question and answer. So take a look at your screen and figure out where that is, and you can submit questions, and then they will be answered towards the end. So Dr. Patty Skinkis is a professor and viticulture extension specialist at Oregon State University. She has a BS in horticulture from the University of Wisconsin River Falls and a PhD in horticulture from Purdue University. Dr. Skinkis joined Oregon State University in 2007, where she leads the statewide viticulture extension program, conducts applied viticulture research, and teaches upper division viticulture courses. Thank you, Dr. Skinkis.
All right. Thank you, Keith. That was a very nice and introduction, and it's good to hear that people have learned about some of my work in Oregon. It's very humbling because I feel like, you know, it's a much smaller state with respect to the wine grape growing industry. But I'm happy to be here, to physically even in California, to present this work. I do miss out on interacting with all of you online, but please do ask questions. I really am hoping to have some good interaction online and discussion generated from my presentation. So I talked to Keith at length about vineyard floor management practices that led to the precipitation of the invitation for today's presentation, and hopefully you can take away a few things from what we've done in Oregon. And I recognize that the climate is a bit different than down here, but hopefully it's something that you can walk away with at least one or two key items that may be useful for you. So to start out with, I just want to give you an idea of this size and scope of the wine industry in Oregon. We have just under 36,000 planted acres of wine grapes in the state. We're exclusively a wine grape production state. And we have over 1,100 vineyards. So if you do the math, it's a pretty small vineyard size. Between 20 and 50 acres is our average size vineyard. We do have some larger vineyards, but although we have a very variable sizes of our vineyards, we do have some commonalities across those. Number one production in the state is Pinot Noir. So about 59% of the state's acreage is Pinot Noir. Most of it's dry farmed, and all on rootstock. These are small family farms that usually have to focus on quality, which requires them to do a lot of inputs in their vineyards, and there's a lot of costs involved. The industry is very forward-thinking in terms of sustainability and doing a farmer-friendly and environmental-friendly practices. That really allows us to look at differences in not only how vines are affected, but how the ecosystem is affected in our vineyards. So here's a map of the AVAs across Oregon. The black area you see there is the Willamette Valley. I'm located on main campus in Corvallis, and I do lead the entire viticulture extension program across the state. But the majority of our industry is located within the Willamette Valley. 69% of the total acreage is there, as well as 80% of the Pinot Noir acreage. It is a cool climate, as many of you probably already recognize, but we do have quite a bit of variability in that climate across the state, whether it's from the eastern part or northeastern part to the southern part of Oregon, which is more arid than in the Willamette Valley. But most of my talk today will focus directly on my work in doing applied research studies throughout the Willamette Valley. And to give you some context, I wanted to provide you some information on what we're dealing with in our climate. Our long-term heat units for the season, there's about 2,100 heat units, but in recent years we've been a bit warmer at about 2,400 to 2,500 heat units. We get about 40 to 42 inches of rain per year. Most of that's in the winter or early spring, or between fall and spring. And during the growing season, we might get as low as 10 inches or as much as 14 inches of precipitation. So that's quite a bit of precipitation annually and during the growing season by comparison to some other regions. And it means that we can adequately dry farm many of our vineyards. So to give you an idea of the kind of soils we're dealing with in the Willamette Valley, certainly there are a number of different soil classes, but there's kind of three major groupings that we break it down to for our vineyards. The classes are really broken down by their parent material, so either they're of volcanic origin, sedimentary rock, or from marine sediments. These are oftentimes hillside sites. We have the potential to grow grapes in our valley floor sites. However, most of our emphasis to this point has been mainly on those hillsides or the base of hillsides. Whether they're on hillsides or in the valley, most of the time we have pretty deep soils that are well drained. So that's kind of the nice thing is, although we have some pretty heavy soils on the clay, the silty clay loam realm, they are amazingly well drained. And even when we dig soil pits in winter, we see that we don't have a lot of standing water in most of the sites. Typically, the surface textures between a silty clay loam or variations on those, and the subsurface texture usually is clay. And so these are just some pictures of soil pits that were done in some of our vineyards a couple years ago, actually by one of the speakers here today. You might recognize some of those. Hi, Josh. So these soil pits were actually mapped by somebody else in the crowd. So in terms of the soils in Oregon, we have pretty high soil organic matter compared to a lot of other wine growing regions, and our pH is pretty low. So usually we're dealing in the 5 to 6 range. And oftentimes we know when we look at a soil, if we're in the 6 range, it's mostly been a limed soil, a site that's been limed. And so there's a lot of inputs in terms of liming on an annual basis, but you were looking usually between 2 and 5% organic matter. Our effective rooting depth can usually be about 1 meter in depth, but usually between 36 and 72 inches, with the mean being about 48 inches. And that effective rooting depth is where we see roots in that top profile. And of course, most of our sites in the Willamette Valley are dry farmed. That doesn't mean we don't irrigate. There's more and more sites going into irrigated, design is being irrigated, and those are irrigated based on the soil type, the soil depth, and usually a selection for certain rootstock, mainly Riparia galore, to allow for irrigation as a tool in management. And that's because some vineyard managers are really trying to be able to control vigor a bit more, whereas it's a really big challenge, and they're trying to pick sites that might be able to be managed in that way. So one of our greatest challenges, some might say it's red blotch virus, others might say it's powdery mildew, but in a lot of cases, a lot of those issues also have to deal with managing vigor. So we have a lot of soil moisture, we have a lot of rainfall, we just get a lot of luxurious growth. From a grapevines perspective, I always think Oregon is like a resort. It's always luxurious treatment. They never are at want for rain or soil moisture. There's not a lot of water stress. They're pampered. And then as a result of it, they get a little fat. So then we have to do a lot of working on those plants and to maintain them within our VSP canopies. So these pictures are very common. We get a lot of secondary growth or lateral growth, a lot of secondary crop forming on some of our most vigorous sites. And these are both pictures of VSP trained canopies that need between 3 and 5 hedgings throughout a growing season, depending on the site. And without doing that, we get significant shading, which can lead to disease and decreased fruit quality. So in managing that canopy from from a perspective of a Californian grower, a lot of times when I've given these talks, they say, well, why don't they just shut off the water? Well, that would be something that would be fantastic to be able to do, but the water does shut off after about July, but then we're left with all of the residual soil moisture that the vines are using throughout the growing season. So we still have to spend a lot of time. We probably spend more money on canopy management than we do even on disease management. So we do shoot thinning pretty aggressively, shoot positioning, sucker removal multiple times, leaf removal, cluster thinning, which takes about 37% of our annual vineyard management budget. So as a result of that, we've been really trying to figure out ways to use our next best tool, which we don't have irrigation to just shut down growth. So we wanted to look at ways we could use vineyard floor management to do so. So my very first project I started when I was in Oregon in 2007 was actually not my idea. It was actually a grower's idea. They said, the minute I was hired, they said, okay, we want you to work on this project. We want to evaluate whether we need to till between our alleyways or whether we should grow grass or if we should do alternate rows, so doing grass tilled, grass tilled. And their main question was what creates the best quality? And I thought, well, there's a lot more questions we can ask than what creates the best quality, questions about whether we need to irrigate more or whether it's even competitive. I was brand new to Oregon, so I had no idea. I was coming from Indiana, so everything on the West Coast was different to me. So I came in with fresh eyes, and we had this study initially developed in a different block, but I knew I had to be able to design it appropriately. And luckily, the grower had another block that was very suitable for this trial. And we did 9 years of research on this. Now, I didn't at the outset decide to do 9 years. We actually went through 3 phases of the research. I'm not going to go into the details of those 3 phases, but I'm going to talk about the overarching aspect of this trial, which was that we had compared these very simple vineyard floor management practices over the 9 years. But we went from just looking at the vineyard floor management practices in the first 4 years, then in the second 3 years, we looked at the impacts of overlaying with that crop level to affect vine balance. And the third phase was really looking more physiologically at how those vineyard floor management practices effectively changed vine balance and fruitfulness, and also carbon and nitrogen reserves. So the primary research question, which I'm going to focus on today, was can vineyard floor management reduce vegetative growth to achieve vine balance and in turn improve wine quality, which is #1 focus of the Oregon industry. They're not going to do something unless they believe that they're going to have improved wine quality. And at that time in 2007, vineyard managers were basically mainly doing 2 things. They were either doing nothing to their vineyard floor other than applying herbicide to the undervine area, or they were tilling everything up because they were concerned about potential water stress. So the hypothesis in the beginning was, well, if we use grass cover between our vine rows, that we will have too much, it'll help regulate vine size, but it's going to lead to soil moisture issues. So we would have to irrigate. So that was the big question then. And there was a wish list of the industry. They said, we want to figure out what we can do, but we don't want to add more water if possible because we're dry farmed. And we don't want to add more nutrients because we know we have a vigor issue. But we want to improve quality and we want to reduce labor. So, everything all in one. So it was a big task to be able to take on this project. So this vineyard we used was in the Dundee Hills AVA, which is a very well-known district for producing wine grapes in Oregon. It was Pinot Noir 115 on 10114 rootstock, which is at the time was the most planted clone of Pinot Noir and one of the most planted rootstocks. So it was a good block to use. It was 15 years old at the start of the study, and it was on moderate spacing. So the 7x5 spacing is pretty typical for Oregon vineyards. And it was on a Jory soil, which is our most common or most prized soil type, which is a silty clay loam. And it was irrigated. You can see even in the picture some irrigation tubing there. However, I say not exactly because at the outset of the study, we had it set up as a split plot, that there was both an irrigated and a dry in the experiment. But as we went through the study, we found out that it really didn't need to be irrigated, #1. But #2, they irrigated so little it wouldn't even register in our soil moisture readings. So we just bulked those, made the split plot a regular plot within the project. So in terms of the experimental design of this project, we went into the project with what the grower already had planted. So they planted perennial red fescue in 2004. So 3 years prior to the start of the study, it was all planted with that in all alleyways. But we went in and started these 3 treatments. We either tilled all alleyways, or we went from tilled grass, which is we called alternate, or we just let the perennial grass grow between the vine rows and just maintained it by mowing. Now, in the spring, we used a PTO-driven rototiller to till up the cover crop that was in the alternate rows or in the tilled areas. During fall, they would put down a cover crop. Usually it was oats or something pretty inexpensive just to keep the soil in place during winter. And then that would be tilled up in spring. There weren't any legumes seeded. It normally was a grain. And then in the alleys, even though this picture looks pretty weedy at this time, they just hadn't gotten in there. That year they've used undervine tillage, but they either use an herbicide application or a combination of herbicide and tillage to maintain the undervine space relatively clean of vegetation. And usually that space was pretty narrow. It was probably only about 15 inches wide that were under the vines, and then the grass was the rest of the space between the vine row. So we maintained, once we installed those treatments, they were maintained for the life of the study. And we were really trying to document a lot of different parameters, mainly trying to see how much we would reduce vine vigor by looking at shoot growth and leaf area. We monitored fruitfulness to see how that might be changed over time, as we know that stressing a vine over time can lead to changes in that, which also can lead to changes in yield. And we looked at cluster metrics over time. We looked at soil moisture under vine. We did not look at soil moisture between the vine row because this is a commercial vineyard and we figured we would have a lot of losses there, although it would have been fantastic to be able to look inter-row, but we did within the vine row. And that picture there with, you see the yellow top, that's the capacitance probe tube, and that tube allowed us to measure with a probe down from 0 to 76 centimeters. We also monitored vine water status about every 7 to 10 days throughout the growing season, starting at bloom. And then we looked at leaf chlorophyll levels to kind of monitor vine nutrient status along with how the canopies are responding through their chlorophyll development. We looked at bloom and Véraison tissue testing. In the early years, we were on a more limited budget, so we looked at fewer nutrients, and most often we were focusing mainly on nitrogen. And then, of course, we looked at fruit and wine composition. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the fruit and wine composition today because I really want to focus on the soil aspects of this project. So the vine growth effects definitely took place in this vineyard. So in the first 4 years of the project, where we only evaluated the 3 main plot, grass, alternate, and tilled, we found a significant reduction in canopy growth without making the vine sickly. We reduced pruning weights by year 2. We decreased shoot length early in the season, which was fantastic because a lot of times when we have so much soil moisture going into the season, we end up with a bit too much growth. And if we get a drier late season, it could really crash. So we were really hoping we could kind of reduce the amount of vigor, but we didn't reduce development or phenology. So we would have the same number of nodes, they just wouldn't be as tall. So that shoot length came a little bit later than when we saw pruning weight reductions. That was about year 3 or 4. And leaf area was reduced by year 3 or 4. We, in fact, also started to see yield reductions. And when I say yield reductions, this was even based on when they did their standardized thinning practices. So we didn't tell them to not restrict crop. They used their normal practices and went through and thinned pretty lightly. I would say only about 10 to 15% of the crop was removed when they did their cluster thinning, but we did see a reduction in yield at the later stages, so year 4. And we did mostly reduce tissue nitrogen by looking at our bloom and Véraison tissue data, and that was by year 3. So the main point was it wasn't drastic and it wasn't immediate. So it took a bit of time for this to occur. Now keep in mind that the grass treatment had the vineyard floor treatment, the grass planted since 2004. So you could even say that it took more than just the 3 years to see a change in at least that grass treatment. But by having tillage, we definitely saw some major impacts. So canopy growth was affected before the yield. So to give you an example of what kind of changes we were seeing, this is the grass treatment in year 3. So it looks still pretty healthy. The difference that we really saw, and it might be a little bit difficult to see in this picture, was looking at just the sunlight infiltration. This is a picture taken at 9 a.m. looking with not only the canopy gaps, but also the light coming through, and looking at the vineyard floor there to see how much light is cast on the vineyard floor from the grass versus the tilled was pretty much a solid bank of leaves. We did control for shoot density. Just in normal vineyard practices, they were shoot thin the same way. Our biggest differences in leaf area were found by leaf size, and also leaf number and number of laterals, with the tilled alleys having many more laterals than our grass vines and larger leaves. In terms of growth, as we got into kind of the second stage of this research, where we looked at both crop level and the main plot of the vineyard floor practices, we did see that continued decline or decrease in vine vigor. And this here is the shoot leaf area at bloom and Véraison. So the grass treatment had about 20 to 40% reduction in leaf area compared to tilled. So if you see those the darkest bars there, that's the grass, and the darker gray is the tilled. And alternate is interesting because it often acted more like the tilled, but was a little bit in between both of those treatments. And then at Véraison, we had about a 21 to 45% lower leaf area with our grass treatment. And there's a lot of benefits to having a smaller canopy. In this case, it was potentially better for disease management, improving fruit quality, as well as having less requirement of canopy management. So here's a great example. This is in the final year of the study in year 9. If you look closely, you'll see the vineyard floor treatments. There's tilled there in the background and grass in the foreground. And if you look really closely, if you look for where the posts are and the top of the canopy, the blue line there is in the tilled. That's where the hedge box, I would say, is where they've been hedged. The grass hasn't even filled that hedge box. So they're significantly reduced. Even though we measured a lot of their growth within a hedge system, we did have the canopies not growing as vigorously. But you can see they're still healthy looking and green. So we weren't decreasing canopy growth so much that these vines were really terribly weakened. So what led to this decline in growth or tweaking of vine vigor? So looking at the undervine soil moisture, this is the plot of all of the years of data when we took all of the treatments within a year and averaged them. And I did this because most of the time we didn't have very many differences, but 2008 was our driest season, and one of our wettest seasons was 2013. But we can see that our percentage of volumetric soil moisture for a Jory soil was pretty high. Usually between 12 and 18% would be when we would start to be concerned about soil moisture, but we were well above that for most of the growing seasons each year. So we are well above that, about 20 for most of the seasons. In terms of the soil moisture impacts by year, when we looked at each depth and we looked at multiple depths within the soil profile and we looked between our treatments, we very rarely saw any differences, whether it was grass, tilled, or alternate, which is a little surprising to us because we thought at least the cover crop would be sucking out more of that moisture during the early part of the growing season, and we really didn't see many differences. So, for example, in year 1, there wasn't any difference at any date, the first year that we would have put this into action. And we thought we might see more differences in year 1, in part because we were just imposing a new vineyard floor practice on the vineyard, and the roots of the vines themselves would be relatively the same. As we got further in the study, we recognized that the root system of the vine might change a bit in response to the vineyard floor practices, and therefore we might not see differences as these roots explore more of the soil profile. By year 2, we saw the similar case where we had some trends that where the alternate was actually the lowest soil moisture and the grass was the highest, but none of them were statistically significant except for the last date. This was our driest season of the 9-year period, and seeing that we didn't have many differences there was pretty interesting in the undervine space. And only that difference in the one date at the latest part of the growing season. And this situation occurred for almost 9 years of the study, so there's not many differences based on our measurements under vine. The 1 year where we did see quite a difference was in 2011, which is one of our coolest seasons. We also had a lot of soil moisture that year. And we saw differences at the 18-inch soil depth, which was pretty interesting, but not at other depths, or I should say from 0 to 18 inches in the soil profile. And that's where we had certainly the highest amount of soil moisture in the tilled and the lowest amount in the grass, which was didn't seem to have too much of an impact on the vines that year, because we had pretty high soil moisture. If you look at the y-axis, we were above 25% and started out the season at about field capacity of 40 to 45%. Now, I mentioned we did also monitor vine water status, because you can sometimes have plenty of soil moisture, and we weren't really sure what our limitations were on this soil and how the vines might respond, especially sometimes because you can have really big canopies, and depending on the conditions, you can still get plant water stress. So we monitored stem water potential throughout this project, and we focused on stem water potential, so keep that in mind. So the numbers might be a little bit lower than if you're used to looking at leaf water potential. And we did not see any differences based on treatment in any of the dates that we took the data, which was surprising to us. Of course, we were never really in a situation where we had plant water stress, and we didn't anticipate we would be until later season, maybe around ripening or near harvest if it was a dry late season. But we found that we would get close, so the -10 there in stem water potential might be slightly close to maybe a -12 bars. If we were looking at leaf water potential, it's usually a difference of about 2 bars. So we did see that we were increasing water stress as we got later in the season, but it wasn't to a point that we would be concerned about having to irrigate. And this is one of the reasons why during the project we ended up abandoning the split plot design of irrigating on top of our main plot trial. So we weren't affecting soil moisture, we weren't influencing stem water potential, but we still had vine size that was declining, and this mainly can be explained by our nitrogen status. So I showed here the bloom petiole nitrogen, because I figure most people are used to looking at bloom petiole data. And we measured a nitrogen status since 2008. We didn't start in the first year of the study because it's kind of T0, but we continued to monitor this through 2015. And we had differences by year 3 of the project, so in 2009. And it clearly separated as we would anticipate, with grass reducing the amount of vine nitrogen status throughout the project. So the only year that we didn't have differences was in 2008 and then in 2015, which was very interesting, that why we didn't have many differences in 2015, but tilled had the most. We figure this is because we're tilling in the cover crop. There's no competition with that nitrogen in the soil, and some of those soils can cycle naturally without having a competitive cover crop in there, cycle quite a bit of nitrogen per year. We personally like to look at Véraison leaf blade nitrogen status in Oregon, because we believe that's a little bit more indicative of what our plant health response and YAN numbers will be. And so we monitored that as well throughout the life of the project, but we didn't start looking at leaf blades until 2009. And we found that leaf blades were in fact different each year of the study from 2009 to 2015. So even though petioles at bloom didn't show a difference in 15, leaf blades at Véraison did. So here's what we had anticipated would happen, is that grass had the lower amount of nitrogen, tilled had the most, and that was what probably was driving our differences in our canopy growth over the years. And to partner with what we saw going on in the plants, we saw that follow through to the fruit. So of course, winemakers are very interested not only in growing a canopy, but growing these grapes. And especially in Oregon, they want to have YAN in the fruit when it comes off of the vineyard. They don't want to have to supplement that in the winery because concerns over quality and off aromas that can develop. So we monitored YAN very closely throughout the entire project. And we didn't we had differences in all years with the exception of 2007. So the very first year of the project, we didn't have differences, but in all of the years, they separated very clearly that grass had the lowest amount of YAN, yeast assimilable nitrogen, alternate was right in the middle, and tilled had the most. In many cases, we found that when we produced wines from this study, we did not have any stuck fermentations. Now, I should mention that the YAN levels that are reported here are based on us using fruit samples that we press to juice and run YAN on right away. So it might be underestimating the amount of YAN compared to what might be extracted from Pinot Noir when it's processed normally in a winery. So they might have been a little bit lower than what those YAN numbers would be. But prior to going to our ferment and getting must samples, we definitely saw this separation as well for our research winery data. And I put the line in there for kind of the commonly used metric for what's the baseline YAN that we're looking for at 140 milligrams per liter. And you can see most years starting in year 2 onward, we had the grass treatment was below that level. In terms of the other nitrogen impacts on the vine that we noticed, I mentioned that yield was affected by about year 4 of the study. And we saw that this was probably linked to a change in fruitfulness, which is also related to vine nitrogen and carbohydrate reserves. We did not measure those things in all of the years. We measured those in the years of 2014 and 2015. And we saw that to be true, that we altered our carbon trunk and root carbon, as well as, or carbohydrates, as well as our nitrogen reserves. But we see the impact starting in year 5, that we have a lower amount of fruitfulness in the grass vines. And we could literally see this when we went through and did our counts and measures of the inflorescences, smaller inflorescences, and good fruit set within there. And it really didn't affect yield too much because they were crop thinning anyway in most of that vineyard. But the interesting thing to note is that the vegetative growth was affected by year 2, but the yield was not affected until year 5. So it's very clear that this impact of the vineyard floor management practices would be affecting growth before fruit composition would be affected, or fruit yield would be affected. So from this study, we learned a lot of good lessons. It was the first kind of study like this that the industry had been involved with, and it really gave them an idea of how they can moderate their vineyard in their vigor in their vineyard, even without irrigation or supplemental nutritional additions. We did not add any nutrients to this project during the 9 years of the study. The only nutrient that was added was boron, and that's because we have a low, usually have pretty low boron in Oregon. So it was foliar boron was the only nutrient added. A lot of people learned good lessons from this project because people would kind of use the field for irrigating if they had water available to them, and they started to think about that more critically, that maybe you don't need to irrigate in those instances just because you have grass between your vine row. There were no water stress differences either. And we believe that's because we had sufficient soil moisture for most growing seasons to get through all of the season without being at a deficit. And the reduced vine nitrogen status really suggests that the grass is competing for that nitrogen directly, but also that we might have more nitrogen available by the vegetation that grew in winter. You know, Oregon, it rains so much in winter that even if you don't plant a cover crop, something's going to grow. Usually it's going to be poa annua. And that will be adding back some nitrogen to the system through tillage. And we also recognize that it might have fundamentally changed our root systems between the two, from grass, alternate, and tilled, to explore different levels of the soil. And we believe that's why we were starting to see some lack of differences as we got later into the project, because they were actually balancing themselves out. And we did do a lot of measurements of photoassimilation and stomatoconductance in some of the later years of the project. And we were trying to quantify whether we were changing water use efficiency, recognizing that if you have a bigger canopy size, you might be also demanding more water use, and in certain years might lead to more water stress. But we weren't able to see very clear differences in water use efficiency, in part because the plants were automatically adjusting to their growth, probably through that root growth. But from this study, what happened, what did growers start doing after they learned from this work? Well, alternating tillage and perennial grass is the most common vineyard floor practice to date in our vineyards. There's some cases where they'll differentially start to apply vineyard floor management, so kind of like variable rate irrigation. We don't really have that ability, so we do variable application of vineyard floor practices throughout a vineyard to be able to adjust vigor accordingly. So where you have vigorous spots, you leave grass in and alter the width of that weed-free zone under the vine as well. But of course, the findings of this work still need to be brought up. I feel like I give a lot of these talks about this project in in the early years of the project, but as we get into this era of no-till or no herbicide use, we're starting to remind growers about, well, here's what can happen if you don't control your undervine space or if you're going to go to no-till. So this is just a picture from last spring, 2019, when a vineyard, and this wasn't just one vineyard, but many vineyards in the Willamette Valley decided that they were going to go away from herbicides, let their undervine weeds grow, which can be a big challenge in Oregon. You can see this is early May, and look at the grass growth up to the heads of the vine. And they did alternate row tillage because they wanted to manage water stress. So it's going to be a concern long term that when you have that much vegetation taking soil moisture out, it can be a concern. Also, in terms of vineyard floor management and how we can apply it to a red blotch situation, here's a vineyard that I was working with that had significant water stress. It's a dry farm vineyard. It has red blotch. This was at harvest in 2018. We really recognized that it needed some boost in vigor, and we recommended that they go in and do alternate row tillage and plant some a cover crop in between. 2018 was a year where we had about 11 inches of rain during the growing, or 11 inches fewer of rain for the growing season than normal. So we were drier than normal, and we recommended that they go in and change their vineyard floor practices. And this is what the canopies looked like on the same date, harvest that same time in 2019. So it made a major difference to that vineyard. Now, how about young vineyards? So I wanted to share with you a couple things that we did in Oregon for vineyard floor management of young vineyards. So it's very common in Oregon to have vineyard floors planted to perennial cover crop, like shown here, and they maintain weed-free space in the vine row. But this is in most of our vineyards where we also have irrigation. There's some vineyards now going in areas where they have no irrigation available to them at all, and most of them want to go to complete tillage. They don't want to have any cover crop to compete with it, and that's kind of the standard practice in most, was before maybe 2010. And our soil and water conservation districts started getting really concerned about that because we have a lot of hillsides with no vegetation on them. And so we did a study where we wanted to grow cover crop and use it as a mulch in a dry farm vineyard system and see what would happen. We grew crimson clover and cereal rye in a 4-year study. We started growing this right after we had planted those vines. So you can't even see the vines there. That's me standing there. This is the amount of cover crop biomass we were able to grow from a fall 2000, I think it was fall 2008, and this would have been spring 2009, right before we mowed that cover crop. Our goal was that we would mow this cover crop and do a couple things with it. Either we would mow it and till it in as normal, or we would mow it, capture it all, and put it in the vine row as a mulch at rates 1 or 3x, or we would remove that biomass, or we would just have nothing growing. And we compared this in a vineyard that has an amity silt loam. It was a valley floor site, so we knew there was probably plenty of soil moisture capacity throughout the growing season. And we looked at a lot of different things in this vineyard. And the goal was to see if we could reduce weed competition, so we wouldn't have to use a significant amount of herbicides. We could improve soil moisture and maybe even get the vines up and established quicker. In this vine study, we planted little vines that we could destructively harvest to see how we could affect biomass. So the plant right here is one of them that we interplanted. So we didn't want to destructively harvest the vineyard manager's vines. This was in a commercial vineyard. We took those out and we looked at how these different practices affected growth. And so in the first year, the Mulch 3 had increased overall total vine biomass. This is leaves, stems, and roots. And the same happened in 2010 when we measured these as well. So years 1 and 2 after we applied these treatments, and we did these treatments each spring. And so with the mulch in 2010, we improved total vine biomass compared to all of the other treatments. By year, this is year 3 in the spring, what the vines look like. We're starting to train them up. And this is summer, you have year 3, so we have pretty full canopies. And we found that we were effectively able to decrease weed growth by using the mulch. We decreased soil compaction, which allowed the roots to explore the soil. And we increased vine biomass, including fruitfulness. So here's just a plot of our data from the 3rd year of the project, where we have the mulch treatments there in the kind of aqua color and the reddish orange, and those basically separated for most of the growing season that we had more shoot growth in those canopies. And these leaves were much more green and had actually higher nitrogen status in both Mulch 1 and Mulch 3. And in terms of soil moisture conservation, we believe that was probably the #1 way that we were getting more growth, was by having more soil moisture there. So this is throughout the entire growing season of 2011, where we had more soil moisture retention in the mulched treatments compared to all of the other treatments. So in terms of the cover crop biomass, because it did have some legume, we assumed it would help boost some nitrogen, but we do believe it was really our preservation of soil moisture and control of weeds that helped us the most. And this is an option for dry farm sites. In fact, some biodynamic and organic vineyards went to trying this out, but we do recommend caution because using that level of mulch was a little concerning for rodents, namely voles. But the biomass didn't stick around terribly long. It usually disintegrated by at least the end of the growing season. So the take-home message, hopefully for today, is that finding the right balance between the type of vegetation and tillage that you use should really be a requirement of looking at what your conditions are. You know, this is a story from Oregon. This will vary based on soil type, your irrigation availability, and your production goals. And there's really no one-size-fits-all method. So I think maybe we have a few minutes for questions. So
we do, yeah. So the first one asks for you to restate what cover crop mix was planted in the tilled portion of the study.
In the tilled portion, we usually put down oats, just a typical oats. And what normally came up was oats and some volunteer vegetation, and often Poa annua or annual bluegrass, which is what oftentimes comes up in the Willamette Valley. It's the grass seed capital of the world, so pretty much we have a lot of grass seed endemic around, so if anything, it's a lot of grasses that are growing rather than broadleaves in terms of volunteer vegetation.
Okay, and the next question says, with a push towards reduced tillage and herbicide, we're moving towards perennial undervine cover crops. What is your experience with undervine cover crops and their ability to reduce vine vigor, soil, plant water status, weed control, etc.?
So we have a lot of interest in growing short-growing, non-stressful to the plant perennial cover crops, but I haven't done any studies on those. The only experience I have with them are from looking at vineyards where we have, where they basically let everything be wall-to-wall cover, whether that's planted or volunteer grasses. And we find that you've got to be very careful with undervine management, because that can significantly reduce vine nitrogen status and water status much quicker than if you don't manage that space. And there's studies that have shown that as well, especially when it's young vines. It could be a major concern. So I would say if we had done wall-to-wall cover, we would have seen more drastic effects quicker. In terms of what to grow, that's a great question. I'm not sure what would be optimum to grow to reduce that amount of stress to have a wall-to-wall cover.
All right, the next one is, they say you see your yield starting to come back to similar levels in the last year. Could this be evidence there is some sort of adjustment period where everything is balancing itself out, especially nutritionally? Would you expect yields from no-till grass to continue to be significantly lower than tilled, even though it looked like they were closer in the end?
So that was a very curious year because 2015 was our highest crop level year ever. And that might have been what threw us off in that year, but I would have suspected that it would create more differences within that project. So it's hard to say for sure. If we had continued going with that project, it would be interesting to see, but I can tell you that the owner of that vineyard maintained some of those treatments in place, and it seemed like they have variable response. It's not that they have 100% the same at stage, but it does lead to question how going further in the study it might have been impacted. It might have been just an effect of the year.
Okay, the next one said, when growers implement alternative row tillage with perennial grass cover in Oregon, how many years does the row planted to perennial grass remain untilled?
So they keep it a pretty long time. Some people may choose to change it out, especially if the stand starts to have encroachment of other weeds. So in this study, we did not control for that. We didn't replant the grasses, but oftentimes you'll see that you get a weed shift. So we did see some perennial, in the perennial grass, some weed species come in, and that's very common to see. And some growers will go a pretty long time before they would renovate that grass alley.
Okay, and do you have a baseline soil for organic matter on these different plots? Was organic matter measured at the end of the study?
We never measured organic matter in the soil. We know that for jewelry soils, we probably would be around 5 to 6 or 4 to 6% organic matter, but we didn't measure that specifically in this project. And if we had measured in the beginning to the end, I doubt it would be any different. In the young vine study, we did measure a lot more soil parameters, and we expected a lot more changes in that study, and we found very little. And we believed it was because that site was previously a grass farm, and we would never make a dent in that carbon or that organic matter with the level of change we were making. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is about dry farming. They say, I run into a lot of dry farmers that do what they call dust mulching. Their belief is that tilling the soils will reduce moisture evaporation from the soil. Does this actually influence or reduce evaporation of moisture?
So that's a great question. I believe that might be some of the reason we don't see as many differences with our tilled treatment. And in some years, we actually see a trend towards the tilled treatment having more soil moisture than or less soil moisture. So it's hard to say because we didn't measure the soil moisture of the alleyway, but that's a great question. That's something that I'm planning to hopefully look at in the future with a new trial that we're starting where we're looking at alleyway soil moisture that we weren't able to do in this study.
And then can you till your undercover crop rather than disc it in?
The undervine cover crop?
Mm-hmm.
The undervine cover crop, most of the time they're using a French hoe or some other sort of mechanical means. It's hard to say whether, most people aren't rototilling their undervine. They're usually using some form of cultivation. Now, in the alleyway, they could use disking or rototilling. Disking will leave bigger clods that are harder for workers to walk through than rototilling, and that's why their vineyard that we worked with chose rototilling.
And then can you please explain how tillage affects soil moisture content?
So the tillage in this case didn't influence undervine soil moisture content. In terms of what it has the potential to do is remove a cover crop that could substantially pull out more soil moisture, but in some cases it could also lead to loss of soil moisture, especially in the upper layers of the soil, just by evaporation. So it really depends on the soil type and when it's done. We always did our tillage early spring, so shortly after or around bud break, and then it was retilled if any weeds grew. So we did choose to use that as a management practice throughout the vineyard.
And then did you look at the effects of grass cover crops on soil pests, and do you suspect there's any effect?
We did not look at soil pests, and I'm not sure what pests they would be referring to, but we did not quantify that. And I don't know that we would have a major impact. The one thing we did look at in the young vine study was compaction. And of course, worms aren't pests, but we didn't quantify earthworm activity, but we did see a lot of difference in that study where between the unplanted, so where we had no cover crop versus where we grew a cover crop or mulched, we saw a much fluffy, shall we call it, soil, but we didn't measure any pests or issues there.
And then has there been any research on different management strategies regarding perennial grasses and how it affects soil moisture or vine vigor? You
mean different, I'm guessing they mean, okay, mow height. So we didn't add that as a layer of a question in this study, but I would imagine, and I haven't seen studies looking at mow height specifically, but I could see that, the general rule of thumb is that a grass will affect, its root system will be altered by how it's managed in terms of mowing. So if it's shorter, it's going to have a more shallow root system than if it's let to grow long. And so we do have some growers in the Willamette Valley who will choose to not mow their grass cover until it's pretty tall, just to suck out more soil moisture out of the system. And it will also take nitrogen out of the system when it does that. And it does work, and that's why we recommend, if it is going to be seemingly a dry season, that they mow earlier to kind of control that rather than waiting too late.
And then can you clarify the difference between 1 times mulching and 3 times mulching?
So the one times rate was basically taking the amount of cover crop that was grown in the alleys between the vine rows and just putting that on. That became our one rate. And our 3x rate was taking that amount and multiplying it by 3. So it essentially required that we take cover crop from other areas of the project and add that where we were taking it off other sections. We would weigh it out and actually put it back out based on what we had calculated from a single alley.
Okay, and then this question is about carbon footprint. So they said that they've heard your carbon footprint is larger when planting a cover crop, and do you know whether or not that's true?
I haven't quantified it in terms of, we would have to compare it to what it's being compared against. So if you're planting a cover crop, and if it's a permanent one that's going to be in the ground a long time and it's going to become a no-till, then it's probably less of a concern than if it's a one that's going to be tilled in repeatedly. So I think it depends on what type of cover crop it is, and certainly the carbon footprint is a big question, especially when it comes to comparing to herbicide use and those sorts of things. So that we didn't quantify in this project. It'd be difficult to do so.
Okay, and then the last question is for you around the future of your research and similar projects.
The future of this research is certainly with the shift towards a no-till and no herbicide use. I can see doing reinstating some of this work and addressing some questions about some of these things, like when to mow, when to till. We're starting the first phase of that by first classifying the soil moisture of our 3 main classes in the Willamette Valley. We just started that this year by putting soil moisture probes in the field in a descriptive study to look at these 3 soil types. To try to understand what the soil moisture dynamics are and the plant growth patterns over the next 3 seasons. And we hope to overlay that with different vineyard floor practices. So that's where the future of that project is going.
Great. Well, thank you, Patty.
Thank you.